The workday ended the way it always did, with screens going dark and chairs sliding back, but for Daniel Harper the air felt heavier, charged with a quiet tension he could not explain, as if the building itself was holding its breath while people filtered out into the early Chicago evening, and he told himself it was just another Thursday, just another closing hour. Yet his attention kept drifting to the glass-walled office at the end of the hall where Laura Mitchell, his boss, still stood by the window instead of leaving like she usually did, her jacket folded over her arm rather than worn, her posture less rigid than normal, and when Daniel finally passed by to say a polite goodbye, expecting the usual nod or brief smile, she surprised him by asking if he was free for a coffee, her voice calm but softer than he was used to, and the question itself felt like a step outside the careful lines they both followed every day, making him pause just long enough to notice how quiet the office had become, how the hum of computers had faded, how the moment felt private in a way work rarely allowed, and he agreed before overthinking it, because saying no felt like closing a door he did not yet understand. So they walked together into the evening streets where the city lights blinked on and traffic moved in steady waves, and Daniel noticed small details he had never allowed himself to see before, like how Laura walked a little slower than usual, how she looked up at the sky once, as if checking the weather, how she seemed less like a manager and more like a person easing out of a role she wore all day, and at the cafe they chose a quiet table near the window, ordered quickly, and sat facing each other with cups warming their hands. And for a moment neither spoke, not because there was nothing to say but because too much sat between them, months of shared projects, late meetings, quiet respect, and feelings Daniel had kept locked away because rules were clear and lines were firm. And then Laura did something that unsettled him more than the invitation itself. She placed her phone face down on the table, met his eyes, and told him that tonight he did not need to wait for her to lead the conversation, that he could speak freely. And the words landed with weight because they shifted the balance he had grown used to, and Daniel felt the pull of honesty pushing against caution, felt the risk in saying anything real, but also felt the relief of being allowed to speak without watching every word. So he talked about the day, about how the city felt different after hours, about how work often blurred into life until both felt rushed and thin, and as he spoke he realized Laura was truly listening, not planning a reply, not managing the moment, just listening. And that alone made his words come faster, simpler, more true, and he told her how he admired the way she stayed calm when others panicked, how her leadership made people feel steady, and he stopped short of saying more, aware of where such words could lead. Yet Laura did not pull back, did not correct him, she only nodded, her expression thoughtful, and admitted that she was tired of always being the one expected to decide, to guide, to hold everything together. And that tonight she wanted to see what it felt like to let go just a little, and the honesty between them built quickly, like a bridge formed plank by plank, each sentence carrying them further from the safe distance of work and closer to something personal, something unplanned. And Daniel felt the pace of the evening quicken, not in movement but in meaning, as if time itself had leaned forward to listen. And when they finally stepped back outside, the night air cool and clear, the city sounded different to him, fuller. And he realized that nothing dramatic had happened, no line had been crossed, no promise made, yet everything felt changed, because in that simple walk and quiet conversation Laura had given him something rare, not permission to act, but permission to be heard. And as they stood under the streetlights before going their separate ways, Daniel understood that this evening was not an ending or a beginning but a door left slightly open, and whether they stepped through it later or not, he would remember the moment his boss looked at him and chose, just for one evening, to listen instead of lead. Daniel stared at his coffee, the steam curling up like quiet thoughts he had kept to himself for too long, and for once he allowed himself to speak without filtering, to let words move freely between them after months of careful restraint, starting with small truths about work and life, the pressure of deadlines, the constant expectations that weighed on him and, he realized, on Laura too. And as he spoke, he saw her eyes soften, her usual composed mask giving way to something warmer, more human, the kind of expression that invited trust rather than demanded attention, and it shocked him to feel how much he wanted her to hear every word, how much he had rehearsed sentences in his mind only to discover the real ones came easier when spoken aloud, and he found himself admitting admiration not only for her leadership but for her way of handling herself, her calm in the chaos, her strength that often hid tenderness. And he noticed that she wasn't interrupting, wasn't correcting, simply listening, absorbing the words as if they mattered more than deadlines or schedules, and that act of listening made him bolder, made him take the small steps toward honesty he had never dared in the office, and he told her about how lonely some moments could feel despite the team around him, how he sometimes wondered if anyone else noticed the quiet weight everyone carried, and Laura responded not with advice but with acknowledgement, nodding, leaning back slightly, letting him continue without the usual subtle cues of authority, and the conversation flowed, turning from work into dreams, into fleeting personal memories, moments that usually stayed locked away from professional eyes, and Daniel realized with a jolt how rare it was to feel this scene, how rare it was to have the person who seemed so in control let him take the lead, let him speak first, decide what mattered, decide the rhythm of the conversation, and every confession, every small vulnerability, built a bridge between them, each word carrying trust, attraction, and a sense of shared humanity, and as he spoke about fears, hopes, and the exhaustion of constant responsibility, he noticed Laura's hand resting lightly near her coffee cup, her gaze steady and warm, her shoulders relaxing, and the usual barrier between boss and employee softened into something tender, something intimate yet respectful, the kind of closeness that doesn't need physical touch but exists in shared silence, in careful words, in the permission to speak freely, and Daniel felt a strange, thrilling fear that this moment could not last, that stepping out of this shared bubble would return them to routine, rules, and distance, yet the risk felt worth it, because honesty, finally, was more powerful than caution, and he continued, telling her about the small joys in life he often overlooked, little victories and quiet pleasures, and Laura listened, occasionally smiling, occasionally sighing, her presence steady, encouraging, allowing him to explore thoughts he had tucked away, to test boundaries without fear, and with every passing minute, Daniel realized that the act of leading the conversation was liberating, that he could guide the flow, choose what to reveal, what to explore, and Laura's trust made the moment electric in its simplicity, not romantic in a loud, dramatic way, but in the gentle, poignant awareness of two people connecting deeply, honestly, without pretense, and as he spoke about how much he had admired her from afar, how much he had respected her and secretly wondered about the person behind the professional exterior, he felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, in the space between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that this night was different, that words spoken under warm lights and shared smiles had weight, that something had begun which could not be fully named yet, and Laura finally spoke, breaking the quiet just enough to guide him gently into reflection, saying that she too had felt the burden of always leading, always deciding, always managing, and that tonight, letting him speak first was a relief, a gift she had not realized she needed, and Daniel felt his chest tighten. The conversation opening doors to emotions he had barely admitted to himself, the thrill of trust, the sweetness of vulnerability, and the quiet ache of longing, and as they finished their coffee, neither wanted to leave, the cafe lights casting soft shadows across their faces, and Daniel understood that in allowing him to lead, Laura had shown more than permission, she had shown faith, attention, and a rare willingness to share a piece of herself, and the weight of that understanding left him both exhilarated and nervous, aware that the night had changed the balance between them, that what began as a simple walk and coffee had turned into a quiet revelation of feelings, an unspoken promise that honesty and connection could exist even within the walls of professional life, and as they stepped back into the cool night, Daniel felt the city around him alive, vibrant, full of possibility, because he carried with him the memory of her listening, of her trust, and of the rare, electric moment when she let him lead. Not only in conversation but, unknowingly, in the beginning of something that neither dared to fully name, yet both felt deeply in the spaces between their words. The walk back from the cafe was quiet at first, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty, as if the night itself had wrapped them in a shared bubble, and Daniel noticed every detail of Laura's presence, the subtle sway of her coat, the way her hair caught the streetlight, the soft cadence of her steps, and he felt a thrill he could not name. A mix of admiration, longing, and something tender that had nothing to do with work, and when they reached a quieter corner, he stopped, unable to let the moment pass without speaking, and said carefully that he did not want to make things complicated, that he felt the shift between them but did not want to cross boundaries carelessly, and Laura met his gaze with steady eyes that were honest and open, her usual control softened by vulnerability, And she admitted that what they shared that evening mattered to her too, that it was scary because it was real, because it involved hearts and feelings outside of office walls, and Daniel felt his chest tighten, the truth of the moment pressing gently against him, as if every word, every glance, carried the weight of months of unspoken thoughts and unnoticed sparks, and Laura took a small step closer, enough to shrink the space between them, not touching, but close enough that he felt the warmth and presence, the careful negotiation of emotion that was both thrilling and safe, and she told him that she trusted him, that she had let him lead the conversation tonight because she wanted to see him honestly, and Daniel understood that her trust was rare, deliberate, and precious, that it was an offering he could not squander, and he realized how much he wanted to honor it, how much he wanted to protect the moment without rushing it, and they stood there under the streetlights, the hum of the city around them fading to a background note, two people suspended in time, aware of feelings that were no longer hidden, aware of a connection that had quietly deepened, and Daniel felt a rush of emotion, the delicate thrill of mutual recognition, the intimacy of shared vulnerability, the subtle pull of attraction that was respectful, restrained, yet undeniable, and Laura spoke again, softly, asking them not to rush, not to force anything, but to remember that tonight had opened a door, that it had shown them a glimpse of something rare, a quiet closeness built on honesty and listening, and as she reached for her car, pausing before stepping inside, Daniel caught the flicker of hope and hesitation in her expression, realizing that this was more than a casual coffee, more than a friendly conversation, that they had navigated the line between professional and personal with care, and in that brief, suspended moment, he felt the weight of possibility pressing gently against him, the awareness that whatever happened next depended on patience, respect, and the courage to continue being honest. And when Laura finally drove away, Daniel remained standing under the light, the cool air brushing against him, his mind racing yet quiet, the evening etched into him with clarity, and he understood that the hardest part was not speaking, but waiting to see if the connection they had built tonight would grow, if trust would turn into something deeper, if the quiet acknowledgement of feelings could survive the return to routine, yet even in that uncertainty, there was joy, a soft, thrilling hope. Because for the first time he felt seen, heard, and trusted in a way that went beyond work, beyond titles, beyond rules, and he carried that moment with him, each step back toward his apartment lighter than before, full of a newfound awareness that human connection, when nurtured with honesty and care, could create magic in ordinary places, and that evening, with Laura allowing him to lead, had opened a door to that magic, leaving him suspended in wonder, longing, and anticipation of what might come, a delicate tension that was both beautiful and profound, as if the city around him had paused to honor the rare honesty they had shared, and Daniel realized that nights like this were not about endings or beginnings but about the subtle shifts that change everything quietly, permanently, and that sometimes, the most powerful moments are the ones spoken softly, carried in glances and trust, leaving hearts aware, awake, and ready for the next chapter, however slowly it might arrive. The week that followed felt different from the very first moment Daniel stepped back into the office, as if the city outside had shifted, the routine sounds of typing, printers, and muted conversations carrying an unspoken weight, and he noticed every glance from Laura, brief but meaningful, each one leaving a flutter in his chest that was both thrilling and cautious, and though their interactions remained professional, there was an undercurrent of something more, a quiet electricity that made ordinary meetings feel alive. And Daniel felt a constant awareness of her presence, a steady pull that made him want to speak, to connect, to find moments of honesty amid deadlines and schedules, and one evening, arriving at his desk after a long day, he found a small handwritten note resting on the polished surface, simple, elegant, the paper slightly textured under his fingertips, and his name written across it made his heart skip, and opening it, he read a few words that carried warmth, trust, and anticipation. Thank you for that conversation. We'll talk again, when the time is right, and a rush of emotion hit him, relief, hope, and a deep sense of connection that was not loud or dramatic, but quietly powerful, as if the note alone confirmed that their evening had mattered, that their honesty had been received, that what had begun was not fleeting, and Daniel smiled, careful not to let the intensity of feeling show too openly, aware that professionalism remained important, but secretly thrilled by the acknowledgement of their shared moment, and over the next days, he carried the memory of that night in every interaction, in every shared task, in every email and brief meeting, noticing how Laura's subtle gestures, an encouraging nod, a lingering glance, a soft tone, made routine tasks feel meaningful, and he responded with care, attentiveness, and respect, each action building a quiet dialogue that existed beneath words, a connection that was emotional rather than physical, tender rather than rushed, and he reflected on how rare it was to feel this seen, to feel that someone in a position of authority could trust him, rely on him, and still allow a personal thread to grow between them, and as the office lights dimmed each day and people left, he often lingered mentally in the moments they had shared, the way the evening had opened doors to vulnerability, trust, and unspoken understanding, imagining conversations that might come, the subtle ways in which they might continue building their bond, and he realized that the note was more than a gesture, it was a promise of patience, a signal that honesty and connection could exist without forcing immediacy, that feelings could grow at their own pace without pressure, and that the foundation laid that night was strong because it was respectful, gentle, and carefully nurtured, and Daniel felt a deep gratitude for the way Laura had let him lead, had listened without judgment, and had shared a piece of herself that few ever saw, creating a safe space where emotions could exist alongside professionalism, where longing could coexist with responsibility, and where connection could thrive in quiet, meaningful ways, and as he placed the note back on his desk, he understood that love, or at least the beginnings of it, was not always about grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but about small, consistent moments of trust, attention, and acknowledgement, and that evening had changed everything subtly but profoundly, leaving him aware, alive, and eager for the future, yet content to let it unfold naturally, and he carried with him the lesson that emotional honesty, when met with care and patience, could create a bond stronger than words, a connection that survived distance, routines, and unspoken rules, and as he finally shut down his computer and stepped into the quiet streets, he felt a rare, gentle excitement, the kind that comes from knowing that two hearts had met in understanding, that trust had been given and received, and that the story they were beginning was not rushed, not forced, but built on mutual respect, shared vulnerability, and the quiet magic of letting someone finally speak and being truly heard, leaving Daniel with a sense of hope, longing, and anticipation that was both thrilling and comforting, the memory of her trust lighting every step, every thought, every heartbeat, and he realized that sometimes the most powerful beginnings are not loud, dramatic, or immediate, but whispered, steady, and rooted in the kind of honest connection that lasts, grows, and deepens with time. And as he looked up at the city lights, he felt a quiet smile spread across his face, knowing that what they had started was safe, genuine, and profoundly theirs, a bond nurtured carefully, emotionally rich, and perfectly aligned with who they were, promising that whatever came next, they would face it with honesty, patience, and mutual respect, and that thought alone carried him forward with warmth, anticipation, and a gentle certainty that this story was only beginning.